Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson, and this video on overcoming nihilism. This is a follow-up to our last video that was an introduction to the basic history and concept of nihilism. So in this video, we want to talk a bit about ways of thinking and ways of approaching nihilism that allows us to get out of the crisis it poses. So we talked in the last video about how Nietzsche probably most profoundly defined nihilism as this absence of meaning and as one that marks particularly this historical age, the modern age with the death of God. And for many of us, if we're in the grips of the modern age and wondering what it's all about and where can there be sources of meaning, what I've always preached in this channel is looking to the tradition, looking to the wisdom of the great books. So we'll use that as one tool to help us think about overcoming nihilism in this video. So reminder that nihilism is this assertion that nothing is something, that nothing is the only foundation of reality, that there's no foundation of our knowledge, that there's no foundation of social and political systems, ethical values, and that our life and the universe has no meaning. And as I said, this is a crisis because I think one way to define the human animal, so to speak, is it's that animal that creates meaning, that takes the disparate phenomena of existence, pulls it together and gathers it together into a stories, into myths, into meaningful arrangements, and is able to live their life that way. I think nihilism presents us with a crisis because our very conditions for existence, what allows human life to thrive, is at issue. So if we want to think about this question of meaning, I think in my mind, it's helpful to start with just thinking about that word. Okay, if nihilism is this absence of meaning, well, what is meaning, and where do we find it, and where are examples where we rely on meaning? And obviously, I think in language itself, when we're communicating as a speaker or reading a book, we attempt to glean the meaning or intention behind the actual syllables or words. Okay, so meaning seems to be tied with trying to find some intention or purpose or goal behind a message or work. Um, it requires, the second point here is it requires attending to the message as a whole. So the parts of a sentence, the parts of a book need to be seen as belonging together as a whole, not as just individual parts, syllables, or words. And it depends on a reference to a reality beyond the words. I don't think we can think of a message as meaningful if we can't posit an existence beyond the words of the message or the words of the book. It has to be meaningful in reference to life, existence beyond the message itself. If there's no meaning, no intention, no purpose, no wholeness beyond the message, if we can't cash the words in for something real, we're left in the words with of Hamlet with words, 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 just words without any let's say meaning or depth behind them. So, using that example of communication, if we're if we use that example to refer back to, okay, we're left in a crisis where we can't see meaning in our life or in the universe, then finding meaning in our life or the universe will rely on finding intention, purpose, an end or telos, or significance beyond the individual actions or moments of our life. So that's, I think, point one. Can we think of our life as having an end, a telos in the ancient Greek sense? And I have a note here. So this is just the way in which the ancients seemed to have thought about their all of existence without some reference. It doesn't only come along with Christian or Judeo-Christian notions of divine providence. It's Aristotle, for instance, in the physics, all beings have an end, or telos, have a purpose to which they unfold. The oak tree being the famous example, we see the potential in the acorn and it's unfolding to that end. It has a certain end and purpose. There's an end and purpose in artifacts that are crafted by an artisan. Modern science eliminated the final cause and the teleological cause from its analysis. And in doing so, I think has contributed to the modern sense of nihilism. So that's point one is I think overcoming nihilism involves trying to think of an end or purpose to existence. And second point is it's about thinking of one's life as a whole, how it not just, let's say, moment to moment, can I get the most pleasure or the most enjoyment out of an individual moment and forget about commitments, duties in the future, in the past. It's about taking one's life as a whole. And thirdly, that this meaning, again, has to be something that transcends our own actions. Just as the meaning in a work, a book, a message has to point to something beyond the words themselves, I don't think it's enough to say, well, the meaning is in my self-actualization in the moment. It's about me being me now. I don't think it can be that self-referential. It has to point beyond something to something that transcends oneself, that is bigger than oneself. So still on this point about meaning, if we're thinking about meaning, I think if we if we delve into this notion of meaning, we'll see that something could have lesser or greater degrees of meaning. So if we think about episodes in a book again, different episodes in relation to the central or core message or themes of the work as a whole may be more or less meaningful in relation to that. So there can be degrees of meaning. So that is to assume that when some life that someone leads could be more or less meaningful in relation to that meaningful end, in relation to that holistic conception, and in relation to that, let's say, transcendent whole. And in relation to this question of degrees of meaning, I think we can assume when someone says, okay, well, I don't know if my life has meaning. I'd like to lead a meaningful life. The assumption is that they want to lead the most meaningful possible in a given context. It's not as though they're going to be satisfied. Okay, well, to use again the book metaphor, I'm a passing reference to a sidewalk that the main character passed along, and there may have been a very oblique symbolic reference of the sidewalk to the central theme, but it's not at all centrally meaningful. I think the assumption is that when people say they want to lead a meaningful life, they want to lead the most meaningful life possible. They want to conduct themselves in such a way that all of the things that we talked about, living to one's purpose, living one's life as a whole, being directed to that which is greater than oneself, that transcends one's own existence, that they're doing that in the most full way. And then the second point is that things can be meaningful, but not necessarily in a good way, right? So a character in a book or a character in real life can be very meaningful, can be very significant, but because they represent something that is we would consider evil or the absence of the good. So my example here is we could say definitely that Hitler led a significant life, a very and in that sense meaningful, but would we say that that is the meaningful life that we aspire to? I think when we say meaningful life, we mean a life led in relation to what Plato would have called the good. So I think there's a few possible answers to this question of meaning. We've talked about, okay, what is meaning? We've talked about it probably has three properties. It refers to a purpose or end. It has to be seen as a whole, and it points to something that transcends the message. So in response to this trying to find meaning in one's life or in existence, there's three general responses. One would be, let's say, supernaturalism or transcendentalism. Again, pointing beyond our natural processes and trying to find meaning in God, our soul, as an essence that endures and transcends our physical or particular uh, physical instantiations from moment to moment. And then we can think of this larger whole that we would participate in as in some ways divine or holy. Then there would be a naturalistic response where we are nothing more than the natural processes that or physical material processes um, of which we consist, and our meaning or purpose is merely the furthering of those processes. For instance, the replication of the selfish gene, to use Richard Dawkins' formulation. So there, the larger whole in which we participate is, let's say, nature or the cosmos. It's not something transcendental in that sense. And then the third response is nihilism. And this is, we had the previous video was an introduction to that, and that's what presents this crisis that we talked about. I think, especially given this, we've been using the parallel with linguistic meaning. This is a good way. This is a good way of thinking about how post-structuralism is a form of nihilism. So its point of departure is Saussurean linguistics, and which sees language as a system of signifiers with no relation to a real world outside of the system, no transcendent referent or meaning. So meaning arises as a relation of words, what the structuralists and the post-structuralists will call signifiers in the system. So for instance, if we're trying to find the meaning of the word cat, it's not what the speaker intends by the word cat or a particular cat, a real cat in the world. Rather, for this point of departure, the signification, they wouldn't use the word meaning. They would the cat signifies or has as its signification the its differential relation to other signifiers or words in the system. So if we look up cat in the dictionary, it'll say something like carnivorous animal, domesticated pet. So what do we have there? We have referrals or deferred meaning, so to speak, by that one signifier, cat, being replaced by other signifiers through these differential relations. We don't get meaning outside the system. We're not pointed beyond it. And there's no end or purpose, no intention. And there's no whole. There's only these differential relations. There's no wholeness to the system. It's not an organic whole. It's a functional, arbitrary whole. And so post-structuralism embraces this nihilism, embraces the fact that there's no transcendent meaning or intention to govern what they would call the play of the signifying system. So they believe that the fact for them that signification is this play of signifiers allows us free range to play in the system and create new ways of signifying. So we can do this creative play within the system, whether it's a system of literary texts for Derrida, socio-political systems, in the case of Foucault, or systems governing gender norms, such as Judith Butler. So overcoming nihilism. So, as I said in the first video, many people in the wake of Nietzsche feel that the kind of the message of Nietzsche and really this is, I think they're reading Nietzsche in the wake of the existentialists such as Camus. They feel that the message is, well, we should embrace this nihilism because it frees us and we can posit our own values without an external standard. So that's what enables us to be free. So as I said, those are really the existential approaches following Nietzsche. Um, and we have it expressed as well in the brothers Karamazov, where it's stated that if there were no God or immortality, then everything would be permitted. So that's the position of Ivan in the brothers Karamazov of Dostoevsky. Absolutely incredible novel, by the way. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. Now, that's for Dostoevsky. He wanted to phrase, let's say, the the challenge of nihilism, so to speak, or the atheistic challenge to our lives in the most profound way. And he does that in his chapter called The Grand Inquisitor, which is a tale told by Ivan, this character. And so this position, this nihilistic position where if there's no God, there's no immortality, then everything is permitted. This nihilistic position of Ivan's is not Dostoevsky's. Let's be clear about that. For Dostoevsky, he wanted to state that position, but then have the rest of the novel overcome that and respond to that challenge. So so we see that in that approach of let's say embracing nihilism in certain forms of existentialism, post-structuralism, as I've said. Um, as I, it's seen as a liberating movement. It frees us to posit our own values. But I think we need to ask, what gives meaning to the life lived facing the absurd, if you're Camus? Or what makes the life decentering text better or a worthier choice than a life of doing drugs? So if you're Derrida and you're saying, okay, well, the free play of interpretation and deconstructing texts and decentering texts, this is what is is freeing, is ennobling. Well, what gives that life meaning? Or if you're Camus and you face the absurd and you say, okay, well, I'm going to embrace the absurdity and the meaninglessness of existence. What gives that life meaning? What makes that free choice a worthier life, that that life of facing the absurd rather than a life of living lies? Well, I think it comes down to, well, it was self-posited, and I think those people asserting that claim have to make a leap of faith that in some way the values that I assert for myself are meaningful. There is nihilism exists, nothing is meaningful except if I say so. Right? And I will be the foundation upon which we can posit truth, the good, and meaning. So there's a certain leap of faith there. There's a certain self-contradiction. Um, it must take those, as I said, those values on faith, and it must. The contradiction is it has to assert that there is something on which we can put that fulcrum that will change from, well, this is absolutely pointless to, no, if I say this is point has a point, then it has then let's follow it and let's do it. Yeah, I think it also falls victim to the critique that the first real modern use of the term nihilism by Friedrich Heinrich Jacobi, he was one of the first to coin this term nihilism to critique German idealism of his time, and his critique, I think, of the German idealists is the same critique we could apply to them, right? That this the consequences of self-reliance and a rationalism without a dependence on something outside of that he felt it had to be a transcendent God, a Judeo-Christian God. Whether you assert it's the Christian God or assert it's something else, there has to be some sort of ground upon which one is making those claims. Otherwise, we're left with the self-defeating arguments of the nihilist. Nietzsche's own answer, we should remind ourselves, to his own path to overcome nihilism was a semi-religious affirmation of the eternal return as a new Dionysian god. So he sees, he has a vision of the eternal return. Zarathustra does. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, there's not a rational argument for it. In his later works, he um, expressed the eternal return as a divine circle. He associated it with a new Dionysus. So I would say that those who claim to follow Nietzsche by seeing the death of God as liberating them to enjoy their own values, or just to be happy, to enjoy the conveniences of modern life, I think are more akin to the last man than the overman in Zarathustrian terms. And I always like this passage from Zarathustra where he's talking about the last man. We have discovered happiness, say the last men, and they blink. So the last men are these products of kind of a bourgeois rationality of the modern capitalism, liberalism that seeks enjoyment through consumer comforts, through not being challenged on to have any goals beyond just just comfort and these types of things. Then I think if we're going to be satisfied that anyone who says, okay, well, as long as I can have my comforts and travel once a month to exotic places and enjoy the occasional sight, then that's a life worth living. I think, as I said, this would be the kind of happiness discovered by the last man rather than the overman. So rather than that type of just relying on self-actualization or self-positing of values, I think finding meaning, and if we look at what the wisdom of the past works have told us, I think it relies on self-transcendence rather than self-positing. So thinking beyond one's own desires, thinking beyond the self. How is one's life fit into a larger whole? And that there's a certain leap of faith that we have to say, well, there's a rationalistic critique and there's the Nietzschean critique of the true, the good, and meaning, but I have to assume that there is something that is good, that this is good. It can be held up to rational critique. However, I'm going to take it on faith that this is good, that this is true, that this has being, that this endures. So I think the wisdom of the great books, and the wisdom of the great books is wisdom that has endured for thousands of years. It's wisdom that is practical as well as theoretical. It's passed down because it worked, so to speak, and it's uh, kind of a way for different generations to teach younger generations how the most successful of them and how they've found a way to get through what may seem like the maze or the fun house of existence. So there's the great books that we'll look at in this particular presentation. I'll just try to pick out a few highlights. There's also the wisdom literature of the Bible, such as Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. I won't refer to those because I find people who are I find that religious texts don't normally cut much ice with those who are grappling with atheistic nihilism. But we can look at, say, more secular works. We'll look at four epics very quickly. And the works of literature rather than philosophy, I do think there's merit in studying the great works of philosophy, but I think in this question, uh, philosophical rationalism in a way is what gets us to nihilism. And literature, on the other hand, derives its power from the poetic and narrative techniques of bringing together disparate parts into a whole, like creating meaning, as opposed to the analytic deconstruction of meaning. So, so as I said, if even if we take a cursory look over the next, let's say, 5 minutes of some key messages of four key epics of the Western tradition, we see that all of them point to forms of heroism, forms of self-sacrifice and transcendence of the self, transcending the momentary needs of the self. All of them point to ways in which we can think of our lives, we can model our lives as meaningful. So for the first epic, and I could refer for you to, I have more extensive videos in all four of these, and I invite you to look at those. And if you haven't read them, I absolutely invite you to read them. Homer's Iliad, so written in 750 before the Common Era. Here, the hero is Achilles, and we see heroism. And for Achilles, the good life, so to speak, is one that secures everlasting fame, kleos aptiton. And this is a martial heroism that, let's say, again, it disregards the comforts of the self to some extent, but to another extent, it's focused on the self in terms of wanting to preserve the fame of the self. And as we'll see in the Odyssey, that solution is found wanting in the next epic. There we see Achilles again in the underworld, where he declares, "By God, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead." So we see a form of heroism. We see a form of finding meaning in life, um, posited by the model of an Achilles. However, we do see, let's say, the limits of that as a root. In the Odyssey, here the hero is Odysseus, of course, and the good life could be seen as a good homecoming, nostos. Odysseus defines himself in his role as father, husband, and ruler of the community. We first see him in book 5. He's on Calypso's island. He's been uh, he's been a prisoner there for 7 years, and he's been offered immortality. He could stay there for eternity with this goddess, and so he rejects that. He wants to embrace the mortal condition. This is unlike Achilles. Achilles wanted to somehow endure. He wanted his fame to endure. He wanted to in the face of mortal existence, couldn't accept that, so to speak. But we see an Odysseus who is unable to act, to be the Odysseus that he really is, and we see in that the fact that Calypso has him prisoner there. Her own name, Calypso, points to what's happening there. The fact that her name seems to mean something like "she who hides," and the real Odysseus is only the real Odysseus when he is able to get back to those roles: father, husband, ruler of the community, part of the home, so to speak. So here we see a form of the good life, finding meaning in one's life again, as beyond oneself. It's not about just trying to find immortality for myself because I want to preserve me and everything about me. It's about one's role and duties and relations to others as family member, as member of the community. And it's about striving toward that end. In the Aeneid, we have an extension of that, and maybe even a furthering of that notion of heroism with Aeneas as hero, who's known for his piety, or pietas, which could be translated as performing one's duty to all to whom one has a duty. So here, and with Virgil more so than in Homer, one's duties also relate to the gods. So Odysseus's piety in relationship to the gods was not really emphasized in Homer, but in the case of Aeneas, it is. A good image that we see of this in the Aeneid of Aeneas's piety is at the end of book 2. He's recounting the fall of Troy, and he recounts how he's leaving Troy as it's burning down, and he he's literally bearing the burden of the nation and his family's past in the form of his father on his shoulder, while he's leading by the hand the future in the form of his son. And but unfortunately, he his wife is behind at a distance, and he neglects to attend to that. And I think that's symbolic for the fact that in the Aeneid, duty is stressed to a high degree in terms of one's political community, but spousal love is not stressed so much as a duty. So Creusa dies because of that neglect. He Aeneas has to abandon Dido in book 4. Another lover, maybe even kind of a spouse, at least in Dido's understanding. He has to abandon her in order to fulfill his duty of founding the Roman line. In Paradise Lost, perhaps we see the completion of this growing sense of needing to serve and to perform one's duty in such a way that it includes spousal love as maybe the highest embodiment, and maybe that's where it starts. So in Paradise Lost, it's that obviously the story of the fall of Adam and Eve in Genesis. And we could say that several characters played different heroic roles. In the beginning, we could see Satan as performing some sort of heroic role. We see the heroism of self-assertion and pride. And, obviously in Christian terms, those are not virtues, but they're presented heroically, or at least in the garb of heroism, by Milton in the first books. He's presented in ways that compare him to the epic heroes of the past. And he defiantly states in book 1, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. And of course, through the course of the epic, we see the limits of his form of heroism. Notably, in book 5, we see Abdiel, an angel who stands firm in loyal service to God in the face of the legions that are following Satan. And the narrator refers to him as among the faithless, faithful only he. So this standing faithful and loyal, even in a crowd of the enormous peer pressure, so to speak. And in the final books, we see the heroism of Adam and Eve. So after the fall, they begin to incriminate one another. However, ultimately, they unite in love. And again, this notion of serving one another, duty to one another, and in these lines, I think sums it up well. But rise, let us no more contend, nor blame each other, blamed enough elsewhere, but strive in offices of love, how we may lighten each other's burden in our share of woe. So I think in Paradise Lost, the message seems to be in contradistinction to Satan's claim, better to reign in hell than serve in heaven. In contradistinction to that claim, I think Milton would agree with Dylan that you're going to have to serve somebody. So it's a famous Bob Dylan song. The heroism of Adam and Eve is in serving one another and serving God and cultivating a paradise within, happier far. It's says the angel Michael in book 12. The Nietzschean postmodernists, I think, would say something like, this is a slave morality. This is produced by weak people who need to make a virtue out of their weakness. I think that would be a Nietzschean postmodern response, that this is just a particular type of moral claim produced by the Christian worldview, etc. And they will say it's far better to rule over others and deposit one's will to power, that type of thing, or that there's uh, different value systems in competition, that type of thing. I think that notion that it's better to rule over others and posit one's will to power, that the ultimate truth is this will to power. I think the result of this line of thinking we've seen over the last centuries. So I'll leave it there. So, in summary, I think rather than merely the self assertion or self actualization of caring for the self because I said so, and it's a self posited value system that is founded on the self. I think we need to care for the self with the goal of transcending the self, with the goal of serving something bigger than ourselves, serving others, serving, uh, trying to see ourselves as having an end or purpose in this service of something larger than ourselves. So I have on this slide, when I think about caring for the self in relation to thinking about how we can transcend the self to something larger, when I think about caring for the self, I think it's a good guide to think about spirit, mind, and body. Again, as I said, we could think of people who say, yeah, well, the good life is all just bodily pleasures, eat the best food, have uh, sex with uh, beautiful partners all of the time. So that would be to see all of one's meaning in, first of all, only the self and nothing that transcends the self, but also only in the bodily aspect of the self. And we need to take care of the body. We need to be healthy. We need to feed it. We need to exercise. We need to we need to have the body be able to serve the larger whole, but we can't, I don't think, make it the foundation. We need to have our mind attuned. We need to have it fresh. We need to have it open. We need to be able to use it to reason and to rationally articulate our own views, communicate with others. And we need to have, I think, a spiritual sense of gratitude and humility in the face of the something that transcends us again. So when I think of the care of the self, I think what I always advise people is to try to find time, whether it's at the end of the day. Myself, I get up early, let's say 4 o'clock in the morning, where I have a bit of time to meditate or pray, as well as read, as well as exercise. So I have time to exercise the spirit, the mind, and the body, all the while. And my best days, not all of us can be this focused every day, but all the while trying to think about how can I be the best person I can be with respect to serving something larger than myself. There you have it. This is my sense of ways to think about how the great works, in this case, four great epics, provide some guidance, some ways of thinking about how we can overcome nihilism, how we can find meaning in this existence. I hope it was helpful and have a great day. Thank you.